I think that, and I've been working in this area for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, and ever since the Gartner people started tracking its upward trajectory and downward trajectory and all that. And as it developed, I think what happened was, and I'm a writer by trade, so I came to this as a long-standing writer, so I sort of saw it from a dialogue standpoint.
Sorry if this goes horribly wrong.
Feedback. Hello? Hello? Oh, that's better. Yeah, I came to this from very much from a dialogue standpoint and an engagement standpoint. And I started working in this area, and as is happening with a lot of what's going on in, voice and email, everything, that the computer is starting to tell us how to write. And so it gives us these little things which we end up using, and pretty soon we're all going to be sort of speaking the same way. And we're going to lose bit by bit a little bit of our individuality. And that sort of applies on chatbots as well, because as I look around the chatbot world, I realize that there's this sort of generic chatbot speak, which is kind of great, please do this, please do that. And it's not bad, it's not terrible by any stretch of the imagination. It's very functional and transactional and utilitarian, but it struck me that if these things are going to be used to sell things or to make engage with customers, they have to be a little more, interesting. Now, I wasn't really sure how to do this myself. I'm sort of experimenting. In fact, if anyone's got better ideas than ones I'm presenting, feel free to tell me. But basically, I thought that there was sort of a process here that might be worth thinking about. So the first thing is, what do I mean by humanize? And what I mean by humanize is essentially make things kind of like us. Because at the end of the day, that's sort of what it's about. These are machines, but they're talking to us. So it's about personality and character. It's about dialogue. It's about voice. It's about that old-fashioned word, wit. And I think it's also about persuasion. And all these things help persuade people to buy things, do things, go places, be impressed by this or that or whatever. And the more you have that, if it's a suitable place for it, and that's what I'll come to later, the better it could be. I'm not saying it will be, I don't know, but I'm thinking it would, and I'm experimenting with some of my customers on that basis. And the last thing is that a lot of this chatbot speak that I see all the time, it's not bad. I'm not trashing it by any stretch of the imagination. It's very good, it's very functional. It's not that, it just, at a certain point in time, the average human starts thinking, I've heard this before, and I'd like to hear something a little more interesting. I didn't even know what I want to hear that's more interesting, just something. In other words, something a little less predictable. So I was thinking about that, and started to work on this process. So the importance of chatbots, I mean, Tim was talking earlier about, what do people think about them, what are these things, and we're all still kind of struggling with this stuff, and we've been doing this for quite a while now, and it's quite fascinating. We're still having these discussions. So I sort of narrowed my area down to a few areas, and one of them is that all our users are us, right? So we're creating these machines to talk to me and you, and we're all, as far as I know, human. So, and then there's this thing called the uncanny valley, which I love as a phrase. I don't use it that often because it's quite well used, but it is it's a good phrase, and sort of what it means is that thing when you're at a party with someone and you're talking to them and you think they're a little weird but you don't really know why, and there's something not quite right. And the same thing is what happens with a chatbot. You kind of are talking to this thing and it doesn't feel particularly natural. It isn't particularly natural. I mean, we've been on this planet for a long time, and 99.999 multiplied by 50 times, we haven't been talking to fucking chatbots. So these things are new, profoundly new, and it takes a while for us to get over that disconnect. And my feeling is, maybe, I don't know, but my feeling is that this humanizing deal might help. And it might help answer some of those questions that we're all talking about, we're all going on about. Now, this is where the previous speaker will, probably, think that I'm, whatever. But I'm not a big AI fan, and I think it's great, but I'm kind of old school, and I think a lot of what we can do with chatbots actually is quite old-fashioned. My favorite chatbot was designed 50 years ago, and it is open-ended, and I think that there's still a tremendous amount of work that could be done in very profound ways without getting too fancy with the AI and the NLP and all these things. I think one day that won't be the case, but I think we may be in a middle ground where the old school and the new school are kind of competing. And the final point is, I raised this earlier because they'd all sound the same, and they kind of do. I mean, they are all a little bit chirpy and quite computery, and they all say please a lot. Please could you do this, please could you do that, which I find really annoying. And there's a certain passive-aggressive quality to a lot of these chatbots, which I find quite irksome. So I just wanted to deal with that. It just bugged me. So anyway, so I worked on, you don't have to read this, I'm just going to, it's a client I worked on, and some of the notes that I've made in this are worth saying. It's a travel assistant, and I think this is one of those areas where what I'm talking about is very valid, because you're going through the airline terminal and you kind of want someone to help you, to be there. So this person's a companion. This thing is a companion. It's there to ping you, it's there to tell you things, it's there to reassure you. It's not just something you shop with and choose the model or the color or the spec or whatever. So with that in mind, it being a companion, it has to have some engagement. It can't just be one of these rote bots, otherwise you won't use it. It's not a fun enough character to be hanging around with you. So we talked about making a humorous, worldly, and I even said a tad cynical to the client, because that's interesting, it's different. And how do we express that? So this was some of the notes, and I did mention that please thing, which just, next time you see a chat when it keeps asking you things and kind of please put your thing, I mean, people don't speak like that. It's kind of, okay. So I just thought it was a little strange. So anyway, that's the sort of setup for this thing. And so I wrote some humanized generic examples taken from this thing, and I sort of spanned them out, just to give you an idea of what I mean by the difference between generic, which is the blue, and the humanized, which is the red. Now this is a very black and white, red and blue analysis, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that there aren't shades here. Of course there are, and we'll get onto that later. But having said that, there are some fundamental points to it. So the basic, just you can read them yourself, whatever you want, but I'll pick out a couple, and I'll add to them why I think that there's some interesting grades here. So you're working with clients, and clients are usually pretty scared people, right? So you're trying to say to them, well, you should do something a little different, and they always say, yeah, I want different, give me different, give me out of the box, and the first thing they say is out of the box. And the quicker they say out of the box, the quicker they want you to go back into it. If it takes a long time, you've actually got a shot. So basically, the blue is the boring, right? So I'm your digital assistant, Billy. I'm Billy, your digital travel companion. And it goes down to, things which are a little outrageous, basically. Now, I'm not saying for 1 minute that anyone at a large corporation will necessarily use this stuff. But I think you should put it out there, because people will notice it, and some of them will. I think a lot of people respond well, as long as you shape it in such a way that the bot is both cheeky but also self-deprecating at the same time. In other words, I'm using human phenomena here, human characteristics. So, I mean, when I wrote this, they didn't like it. I'm putting it in here. What do you want? It was the first thing the person says, and then it realizes it's made a mistake. The bot's made a mistake and is talking to a programmer. So I bring all sorts of other characters into their lives, as if they're somehow real. So in the next one, the ask destination one, that's actually more useful, which is if you're working with an airline and the airline sees that customer goes to the same place a lot, you could have a function in there that enables them to use that, to bring it to the fore, which actually I think would be really cool, because then it's a sense of familiarity between the bot and the user, which I think is really interesting, rather than this constant state of distance. So that's an example. You could do the same thing with Let Me Guess. I mean, it's sort of, I'm not saying it would work. I don't know, to be honest with you, and a lot of things are rejected, but the fact of the matter is I think it's just debate and a discussion that we should all be having, because otherwise everything's going to sound the same for a long time to come. And we're all going to sound the same because of that email thing. So which is another issue. So here's another set. And this is stuff, when things don't work, the please try again, all that stuff, which is, I think, just completely, there are a million ways of doing this, I just used a couple. And again, some of these I hope they're not snarky, I think they're kind of, they're the right side of nice, but they definitely say things which are a little bit different. And they're all very doable. So I think that a few of these things at certain strategic places can, liven things up a little bit. So there's a few of those. And let's see what the next one is. Yeah, feedback response. These again are quite sweet. And if you just sort of look at those, you can sort of see the boring ones of thank you for helping us out. I mean, one of the areas which is the easiest place for these things to use is fallbacks. Because fallbacks, you can choose a ton of different fallbacks. You can randomize them, find out how people think, and they're very easy to use because they have no essential, they don't go anywhere. So fallbacks are a great place to experiment with this kind of stuff. And these are good examples. So, and also things which are following on thanking you, which again are dead ends. You don't have to worry about where it's going. It's just a little moment in time that says, I'm somebody, I'm a thing, rather than just this robot, basically. So that's that. And here's the last one. This is actually the sort of coup de grace, the red one, the big one. It says, hi, Bob, and welcome aboard, flight 124. You're in seat, blah, blah, blah. I know it. Nice, perfectly situated, right? And a vegan meal, and you know this stuff. Last piece of advice, switch your phone to airplane mode now and get it over with, right? So it's like I'm your friend, don't wait till the last minute because you'll get pissed off, let's do it now, let's get it over with. So it's talking to you in a way that your buddy would talk to you, your friend would talk to you, maybe not your wife, your husband, but friend. So that's sort of what I mean. It's basically, I know it sounds pathetic, but sort of livening things up a little bit. And I think over time, we'll find that that's going to be important, because one of the areas that I've noticed in chatbottery is it's a little bit serious. And we're always talking about engagement and keeping people on board and getting them back to do things. And no one ever really talks about the way that the bot personality is a part of that, because it really is. And especially in a commercial environment, there's a lot of tricks that we still have yet to play with bots. So I missed that for now. So basically the upsides are pretty obvious. I mean, the engagement factor is the number one thing. Personification, I think, is critical, and I think there are two parts to personification. The first of them is that, and what I mean by personification is, take Quaker Oats guy, the Quaker Oats guy. It's one of the original personified logo, branded logo, Mr. the Quaker. I would love to see personified logos come back, and I'd like to see them talk. They should be expressing their brand values. It seems like a golden opportunity. I don't really see that. I'd like to see that. You can't have some blobby logo doing that. It has to be a personified logo. And the other word term of it, obviously, is personalization, in which we're using names effectively and carefully, what people are doing, where they're going, for example, as in that travel example, and stuff like that. I think the humanizing is not it doesn't fix everything, it's not right for everything. It's just a set of tools that we really need to explore. And I think it may enable us to get over certain humps that we've been facing in some of these areas. Finally, and Tim talked about this, was about listening, about bots which take a lot of incoming input from the customer, the user. I mentioned Eliza because Eliza was made in 1966, and to this day I still think in some ways it's the most effective chatbot ever made, because it is a listening chatbot. Now, of course, it's a therapist, and therefore it can, that's its job, is to listen and prompt a little bit. But the point being that if the person feels drawn in enough to commit themselves to writing stuff down, that's actually a really interesting thing. And I think we need to work on that a bit more. And I don't think necessarily that the natural language side of that is going to be that effective in the initial stages. Because if someone writes more than a few words, your ability to capture that with high confidence in most NLPs, I just don't think is that high. But nevertheless, I think this humanizing thing, part of it is to listen. So your bot should listen a bit. That's a very difficult thing to do. There are certain kinds where that just simply wouldn't happen. I totally understand that. You've got to pick and choose. So these are important downsides because there is a lot of, these are important. Okay, so with these kind of generic personalities, the dialogue approach to most chatbots, there really isn't a judgment to be made. I mean, they are what they are. No one really talks. Maybe there's a different way of structuring the conversation or a different way of making essentially structure. But really, in terms of the decisions that are made in actual dialogue terms, whether something's amusing or not, whether something is harsh or straightforward or is laid out carefully with nurturing, they aren't really there. So once you get into that, then subjectivity rears its head, and that can always be a big blocker in, corporate and even non-corporate environments where people start getting afraid and they start saying, well, I prefer it like this and I prefer it like that, and then you've got a problem. When you're just doing straightforward genero copy, that's not necessarily an issue. So that's number one. Number two is, it's a little more difficult because you've got to do extra stuff. It's another layer on top of your original plan, your original dialogue conversation set. Thirdly, you usually have to have another set of, another brain in the office to do that because most developers, no offense, are not writers as their number one kind of thing. So, and if they are, then that's freaking fantastic, but it's not something you see that often. So that means another girl or guy showing up to, eat your, power bars and stuff. So that's a factor. And third, finally, the balance between, and this is really important, the balance, if once you've introduced this concept of the sort of the human touch of the robot, you have to find a balance. If you've committed yourself to it, the easy way out is to say, forget about it. Let's just go back to number one, generic, boring. But there's some upsides to it, so you know that. So you want to find there's a balance there. Now, sometimes that balance it depends what kind of product it is, which I'll get to in a second. So I created something which is ridiculous, but as a way of talking about that balance. It's got a very fancy name, which is pretty funny. It's called a Chatbot Human Index, right? And it's just a load of bollocks that I invented to make me look important. But basically, a bot with a CHI of 0, it's like Chicago, is built entirely with genero speak, and it never utilizes humanized. So the little guy is basically speaking essentially in code. And the one with 10 is basically a blabbermouth, right? And you never have a bot that's a blabbermouth. So you've got these two kind of extremes. Now the irony is, we see 0 a lot. We already see 0, but we never see 10. Right? 10 it's just weird, so we never see that. But we're so geared towards slightly dull speaking bots that we don't really mind a 0. So I was thinking maybe there's a way of using this system in its rawest form to kind of help us decide what we want to do. So a CHI of 4 basically means that 4 out of every 10 interactions has some kind of something in it, a little bit different. It needn't be extreme, it could just be a little tiny note in it. So, and what I call RoboSpeak Plus is one of two, so you get two little moments where you've got a tiny bit of extra humanizing, but not enough to really upset the banking community as they're trying to do your transactions. You can use this process either to call a whole script, or you can use it to call parts of the script. So different parts of the script do different things. For example, data collection is often better served by more boring dialogue. People kind of, when they're giving out their information, they kind of don't want you to be a cheeky chappy, they want you to be very straightforward and quite proper. So, but when you're introducing yourselves at the top of the show, yeah, you might want to be a bit more up. So you might want your bot to have a higher CHI, or whatever you want to call it. So there are different ways of looking at this, and I'm not saying we should use this, but the idea of involving human more human approach to language and dialogue is something I think we should consider. So, that's that. Okay, and here's the final thing, which is a few tricks that I use, which may be useful or maybe not for that very reason, which is, and I think this is something that applies to all bots, is that the key thing to a bot is to make it successful. And the key thing to success, in my ability, is simplicity. If you get complex, and I think we all know this, you're going to have a problem. So when you humanize, you're already adding layers. Like, for example, when I did that thing with the Brussels thing, you're already adding to that. So you're adding to it. So you're already augmenting what you've originally done. So you must make sure that you don't do too much, just a little bit. The second thing is tokens, always using names and stuff and vegan meals or whatever you've got going on. The more of that, the better, because that's relating to the user. I mean, and this is true. I mean, if you just are not getting anywhere with it, and it's not connecting, dump it. It's not a must-have, it's a can-have. It's a should-have, maybe, if you think it's right. The fourth thing, which Tim could probably speak to much better than I could, is the idea of AI with what I call HI, which is human intelligence. And I'm interested in the interaction between those two about how keywords and trees, those old school things, can be worked into the new system. Fifthly, as I mentioned, random responses and fallbacks are huge in this, and they're cheap, and you don't have to worry about where they're going to go. And finally, everyone says, I can't write, I can't write, I can't write. Everyone can write. Just read it out to yourself, and if it sounds like shit, it is. Okay? And that applies to whether you're John Steinbeck, Charles Dickens, or you. So I really wouldn't worry about it too much. We can all do this stuff. We're all smart people. And I believe that we could and we should try and experiment with it. And if it works, it works. And then you might remember this and think, that guy said that one time, I can't remember. And if not, you'll think slightly differently. But anyway, thank you very much indeed.
Just before we head off to the pub, a few quick questions. What I say?
Yeah, sorry. I absolutely 100% agree with what you're talking about. In fact, I've spent about 7 years contemplating this very issue. So we could probably interface on a lot of my concepts on that.
Sure.
But, so, would it be fair to say that the abstraction of what you just talked about is to get us to know, like, and trust the bot?
Is to say again?
Is to know, like, and trust the bot.
That's a good question. I actually take it the other way myself, personally. I'm not saying that's not a viable approach. Personally, I think, it's like Alfred Hitchcock used to say about actors, they're cattle. I mean, bots really are cattle. They're dumb, even the AI ones, unless we put life into them. So my tendency is to feel that we are in control and that the thing does what we tell it to do.
Can I get a follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, is the furthest you've got with your concepts to embed this idea through text?
Yes.
Okay, so and there's no framework that you've developed at this stage. This is just a work in progress.
Yes, it's a work in progress.
You should look at the green shoot stuff.
I will. I was very interested in listening to the talk.
Open dialogue might.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I spend a lot of my time trying to sort of find out how this is compatible with other existing frameworks. And I think it is. I have some friends in LA where I spend a lot of my time who are working in dialogue flow, but they're also creative copywriters. So, you're absolutely right. It's a very interesting area. I think that I've been also studying a lot about direct use of chatbots in marketing and advertising, and things like that. And the kind of bots that I'm talking about, essentially clear of AI, and completely controllable, closed-end, dumb bots, right? I think are really interesting because you can have a lot of fun with the user. You're essentially, dare I say, you're manipulating the person who's at the other end. And you have to control them. You have to take them to a given result. I mean, in advertising, that's the job, right? And I think chatbots can be used in advertising much more than they are now.